I just love how food lends itself to storytelling. It just provides an angle that makes it very relatable.
Dirty Linen is always aiming to give diverse voices in the food world a podcast platform. If there's any arena in life which should be always celebrating diversity, it is food. And this week, as we celebrate new voices in food and the Diversity in Food Media Collective, we have the great pleasure of welcoming to Dirty Linen today Anna Kharzeeva. Anna, welcome.
Thank you, Dani. Hi.
It's lovely to have you on the show, and I will also refer listeners to your chat with Anthony Huckstep on My Brother podcast, Deep in the Weeds, where we got to know you and your story a little bit. That was a really lovely chat. Thanks for joining the network again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so in that chat, I guess it was a few months back, and Huck spoke to you about the Soviet diet cookbook, which you've written, and about the circumstances in which you moved to Australia. But for people who haven't had the pleasure of listening to that show, do you want to give us the quick backstory?
Sure. So up until February 24th or, early March this year, I was a Moscow-based food writer, which my website still says, actually. I must correct that. And I'd written a book with my grandmother's stories about the iconic Soviet cookbook called The Book of Tasty and Healthy Food. I sort of cooked over 100 recipes from that book and chatted to my grandmother who'd lived through the Soviet Union to record her recollections and her perspective on the book and on the recipes and on life in the Soviet Union. So that was quite a fascinating journey. When Russia invaded Ukraine, my life as I knew it changed. My country as I knew it completely changed. Following sort of some protesting and some words that I said on ABC actually in Australia, but also on social media, I felt unsafe to stay in Russia, so I left in a hurry. We packed up our bags, my husband, son, and I, just in 24 hours, and got to Istanbul, spent 3 weeks in Istanbul waiting for my Australian visa to come through. And so I've been in Sydney since the 26th of March now. And I spoke to Huck, it must have been in September, I guess, or maybe even earlier. Must have been before I even sort of started working and started to feel somewhat settled. So I feel much more settled now, and it's much better in general. I feel like, I kind of belong now in Sydney, which is nice.
And explain your connection to Australia, Anna, because it's not your first time here.
Yeah, right. So the reason I got to Australia is because my husband is Australian, and I actually had permanent residency while living in Moscow, which I never thought I'd actually really use. But I still needed a visa to get in anyway. And I had been to Australia many times before. I even lived here briefly, just for a few months when I was 21, 15 years ago. So I was somewhat familiar with Australia and with Sydney, even though I'd never properly lived here, I'd never worked here. And I certainly had no plans of moving anywhere outside of Moscow and, not to Sydney. So I did have a connection, but it was also a new place at the same time, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And I think, in Australia, we are somewhat familiar with the idea of refugees from Ukraine as a result of the war, but that you would have to leave Russia so quickly, I think is, it's another concept for us to get our heads around. Can you explain exactly what you felt, why you felt your life was in peril?
Yeah, so you're right. There are lots of Russians leaving Russia. There was a big wave sort of in early March, which is when we left, and another big wave in September, at the end of September, early October, when the drafting was announced, when mostly men started fleeing, and you might have seen footage of it, the border crossings between Russia and Georgia and Russia and Kazakhstan. So basically what happened is, when the war started, they started tightening the bolts in Russia, of course, as well. And they introduced new laws that said that if you support Ukraine in any way, you can get up to 15 years in jail. If you or maybe 20 years, I might be confused now. Or if you shared anything that they regard as fake news, which is basically sharing what is happening in Ukraine, the war, you're spreading fake news and you can get up to 15 years in jail. And it just went from being somewhat not great before the war, which of course it wasn't great because Putin was in power already, but we kind of knew the rules, and it didn't feel completely terrible. It went from that to just feeling like we were living in the Soviet Union. It felt terrible. Just it was a combination of watching what was happening in Ukraine in utter disbelief and shock, and a feeling of, what can I do? Because it felt like, oh, it's my fault, what can I do? But also feeling the fear of prosecution if you do anything. And I went to the protest on the first day of the war, the day it started, and gave that interview afterwards. And I said something that was quite dangerous for me to say, because I was in shock from what was happening. And my husband said, "You've got a target on your forehead, we need to get out." And at first I was like, it's okay, we can stay a bit longer. But then when they said, well, we might introduce martial law, or what they said was, we're not introducing martial law. And I read it as, oh my God, they're definitely introducing martial law, which would mean they could close the borders, they could do whatever they want. And I just got so scared. I just felt like if I don't get out now, I might go to jail. And I also didn't know how long we were leaving for. I was saying goodbye to my mom, and we're like, maybe I'll be able to come back in a couple of months' time. It was completely unclear. And, now we're in Sydney, and things haven't improved at all. No one, I couldn't foresee the war going on for as long as it has. I don't know that anyone has, thought it would go on for as long as it has. And it's just, now I don't know when I'll go back. I'm sort of completely unclear about it.
Yeah, just so many, it's just such a huge situation in your life. And I think, we hear the news of the war, and it can be quite abstract. I mean, I think we hear that, it's the cause of gas prices going up, or it's why cooking oil is more expensive, or it's why there are shortages of wheat in other parts of the world. But it does feel quite distant. I mean, how do you process it? It's very immediate for you. It's really impacted your life so directly and in such a huge way. How do you sort of make sense of the way that Australians are connected but also disconnected from what you've experienced?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I mean, on one hand, Australians don't have an anti-Russian sentiment, which is nice for me. It makes my life easy on a daily basis, because there are countries in which, people are less happy to see any Russians at all, because there are a lot of Russians who support the war, and, I guess it's understandable. But on the other hand, it is strange that it is so far away from here, and for a lot of people, it's just this distant thing that doesn't impact their lives. Whereas for me, it's absolutely crucial. And, there are days when I don't really think about it, and I just go to work and I take my kid to preschool and I cook dinner and I do all of that, because I've got a busy life. But I also, there's just this constant shadow over me, and I do read the news, and when, the shelling is particularly bad, it just puts me in this sort of slow motion mode, of like getting to work and thinking about it. And, then I get distracted by work because, nobody is as impacted by it as I am among my Australian acquaintances, my friends and colleagues, because it's not a part of their lives. It's fair enough. But then I do have Russian friends as well here. And when we get together, we talk about it a lot. And I feel like I can really talk then, I can talk to someone who is as upset by it as I am. And, there's almost no degree of my life improving that will make me feel okay while the war is still going on. Because my life is actually fine now. Like, I've got work, I've got friends, my son's in preschool, he's going to school soon. I feel like I'm fine, I don't feel as completely lost and sort of torn into pieces as I did when I first arrived. But the war is still a major part of my existence, like my stepfather is in Ukraine, for example. He is in Kherson, which was recently returned to Ukraine. They fought for it, they got it back, but there's no electricity, there's no water. And that's why I'm fundraising to help Kherson, because at least I know, at least I can do a little something, because I have never appreciated until this year what it is to have a roof over your head, have enough food, not have to worry about how you're going to cover the basics of your life. That is actually huge. If you have that, you're ahead of so many people in the world. You really are fine. And that realization has been huge for me.
Perspective is, I guess it's a cliche, but it is a gift, but it also, I suppose, is a responsibility. So Anna, what are you actually doing for work in Australia?
So I work for a Jewish nonprofit called Shalom as a program manager / event curator. We just put on a Jewish food and farm festival, which was a lot of fun. And I'm also starting soon at SBS Russian as a producer, as a casual producer. So I'll have 2 jobs. And I've been fortunate enough to write a couple of pieces for SBS Food, which is great. And obviously the book, New Voices on Food, has been a great thing to take part in.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about New Voices on Food, because I suppose that's our focus. I love your piece. I've had the privilege of reading it. Can you tell us, don't give us any spoilers, but tell us about it.
So I saw Lee Tran Lem's post about writing on food, and the focus was past, present, and future. And I started sort of thinking about my connection to Australia, which now sort of goes back about, at least 15 years since I first came to live here briefly. But even before that, like when I met my husband and when I first tried Vegemite, because my husband is a big fan of Vegemite. He doesn't like to go without it for too long, wherever we live. We've lived in Moscow and in Georgia. And I realized that there is this connection, that I can really tell my life story, or at least the last 15 years, kind of through Vegemite, of where we lived, or of whether we had access to it or not, of my relationship with Australia and with Vegemite itself as well. With Vegemite, it's not so complex. At first, I didn't like it, and I liked it. But also about my grandma.
A common journey.
Yeah. Like my grandmother loved it, and she was such a big part of my life. And it was sort of a connecting moment between her and my husband, because he's Australian, she's Russian Jewish. And, my husband speaks Russian, but not really to an extent where he can have like a proper conversation with her about life. But they had this moment of like they both loved Vegemite, and he was so happy that she liked it. She took an instant liking to it, actually, unlike me. And we'd always bring it back for her. And yeah, I just love how food lends itself to storytelling. It just provides an angle that makes it very relatable, and it allows you to tell the story sort of in its complexity, but not all of it, the sides of it that are really interesting and that make it a good read.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It is a lovely piece. I suppose, food is can both be a shorthand for connection, as you speak about with your husband and your grandmother, but then it can also be such an expansive site of conversation and discovery. It can do so many different jobs. And yeah, I love the sort of, I guess there's an economy in using Vegemite. You don't need much Vegemite, on your toast, and you don't need much Vegemite in a story, but it certainly does the job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The thin layer on toast and in the story. I like that.
What do you, from your perspective, what does the Australian food media world look and feel like?
Well, I've been very fortunate to sort of meet Lee-Tran Lam, well, not in person, but to get to know her work and her approach, which is obviously very diverse. And then, with SBS Food as well, they also have such a diverse range of writers and cultures and stuff represented, which is amazing. I mean, I guess in mainstream media, there's a lot of Asian food or, local sort of Australian food, not so much Eastern European. In general, I guess there's not a lot of Eastern European stuff around. But then I hear that there are some Eastern European desserts that are becoming more or less popular, like the honey cake medavik. So, and buckwheat is becoming a bigger thing here, which is nice. It's very much a staple, for Russia, or I think much of Eastern Europe. I certainly grew up having it every morning with milk and sugar. So yeah, I think it is quite diverse, but it is also mostly not what I'm familiar with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because, I suppose buckwheat has come in as, like a health food, quote unquote, superfood, a bit of a sprinkle. Whereas how would you have it for breakfast? Is it more like a porridge?
Yeah. So, I would have, and I make it for my son as well most mornings, just a bowl full of buckwheat with some milk, a fair bit of milk, actually, kind of like cereal. And, I slice up some bananas on top for my son, well, when he agrees to have them, or a bit of honey, or I would have sugar growing up. And then also in Russia, you can have it as a side to anything really, to meat, fish, just plain, but also cooked with mushrooms, onions, in every kind of way, really.
What about fermentation? Because I think fermentation is such a huge conversation in Australia right now, but I would say not so much from the European side, where there is, and if you think about Russian food, there are so many fermented preparations, but I think in Australia we think about it, perhaps we start thinking about it more from the Asian point of view and Asian ferments.
Yeah, you're right. I forgot about fermentation. Yes. Well, when I first noticed it, even, living back in Moscow, noticed it in the English speaking world, the food world, like, oh, fermented this, fermented that, sour cabbage, kind of had a giggle because I grew up with it. It's such a big part of the culture. For us, my grandmother always made sour cabbage, always made pickled cucumbers, gherkins, always, it was just always a part of our lives. And to see it as this sort of cool, hip thing is kind of funny, because it's so not a cool, hip thing, a thing where I come from.
It's a grandma thing.
It's a grandma thing. Yeah, exactly. And mind you, there's a lot of love and longing for grandma's food, where I come from, at least. But that is interesting. Yeah. And it also is sort of a connecting thing. Like, I was showing someone, the Jewish Food Society did a story on sort of my family, my grandmother's food. And I showed a friend this vinaigrette salad, which is boiled or roast potatoes, beetroot, sauerkraut, apple, and vinaigrette dressing. And then, there are different iterations. You can add peas or not. You can add something else. But those are sort of the basic things. And some rye bread. And there were rissoles. And he was like, oh, wow, that looks amazing. Just a young Australian guy. That looks amazing. I would totally eat that. And I realized, oh, yeah, I guess it looks kind of cool from a modern Australian perspective. For me, it's just home food. And vinaigrette, the salad, I made it once in Australia for my in-laws, and they loved it. And I went, oh, yeah, it is actually really cool. Like the apples and the sauerkraut with the beetroot and potatoes and the vinaigrette dressing. It is really nice. I kind of saw it from a different perspective, from the perspective of someone who didn't grow up with it and who is into sauerkraut and things like that. And it's like, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that's so interesting to have this new light shone upon something that is just so basic and normal for you. But I guess, yeah, I mean, often that is an immigration story, isn't it? Partly, you have to explain like what it is. Yeah, you have to introduce people to things that you perhaps haven't ever had to unpick before.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a funny thing. Like, like the aladushki, for example, which are these sort of pikelets that you can make with anything. Like if you've got leftover dairy of any kind, and it doesn't really matter how old it is, it can be pretty old, it all goes into aladushki. And it's this zero waste approach, which is so sort of trending now. It's so cool, and for a good reason, because it's a very good thing to do. But that's how, for my grandmother, that was her life. For my mom, it was just zero waste was just how they lived. It wasn't a cool thing. It wasn't something they were trying to do. It was something they did out of necessity, but got really good at it, were really inventive. And there are lots of things that my grandmother used to make, like a zapikanka, for instance, which is like this bake that you use any leftover grains or pasta or anything like that, with just some egg on the top and a bit of breadcrumbs, roasted. And it's not a terribly exciting food, but it's a way of using up whatever you have, and with some nice sauce and with some nice sauerkraut on the side, it's actually pretty lovely. Yeah, and again, just this approach of not wasting anything is so familiar to me from childhood, but is now cool in Australia as well.
Yeah, well, it should be very cool and very much just a way we think about eating. Anna, is there anything that you really miss that you just can't get here?
To be honest, ingredient-wise, I can get most things here. I mean, some of them are quite far, like at Russian shops, if it's good rye bread or good herring, or some sweets and things like that. They are accessible here, but quite far from where I live. What I miss, and this will sound silly, but what I miss is the ability to just order food on my phone and have it delivered in 20 minutes, groceries, or have a grocery store right next to my place, and have the ability to go every day or every other day and just buy a little bit as I need it, because that's how Moscow operates. There are shops everywhere, and also online shopping is so good. You literally order something and it's there within 20 minutes. And you don't have to think about, oh, I need to get in the car, which I don't have a full license yet. And I live far from the shops. So I had to learn to shop once a week, which is a completely foreign concept to me. And like last weekend, we didn't have time to shop. So, I've been using up whatever we've got in the fridge and the pantry and the freezer to make meals this week because I can't get to the shops by myself. So that's a different concept. And it's interesting, and it's totally possible to learn and adjust to the new way of shopping. But I do miss the ease with which I shopped in Moscow.
That's so interesting because I think a lot of people would perhaps, because they're so used to shopping weekly, for example, they would flip it and they would think, oh my God, what a hassle to have to think about shopping every day. But I guess, this whole, this enormous refrigerator and this enormous pantry and these, people who have extra cupboards or a garage where they can put, trays of tinned tomatoes or whatever it is, that whole idea of bulk and stocking up is so foreign in so many places. And of course, it's pretty new, really, at least in terms of refrigerated goods. I mean, so many people live, without refrigeration. It's a pretty new thing, really. So it's so interesting. I love that. I think we definitely waste more food the more we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when I buy little amounts, I don't waste as much. But I don't know, at the same time, I feel like, the best way not to waste food, like you're definitely not going to waste food if you don't have much money and you have a small budget for groceries, which is the case for me now, So you are a lot more creative and you think more about, okay, I'm going to use this, I'm going to use that. And I mean, for me, like the generations before me lived that way always. And, when when we first got even before we started working, while we were still looking for work, I was thinking, oh my God, we have no money. How am I going to cook? It's so depressing. I'll have to like really think of what I can buy. It's like I'll have to not have a strict budget with groceries. And I thought that's so depressing. And then I went, wait a minute. My mom lived like this. My grandmother lived like this. And they still cook delicious food. It's okay. It's a challenge. You can think about what to buy to make it more cost efficient. And there's actually nothing wrong with it. It's fine. And it was good for me to remember where I come from and to think, okay, actually, you know what? It's all right. It's not the end of the world. You don't have to have expensive ingredients to cook delicious food.
Yeah. So again, with perspective, it is such an important tool. Anna, if we return to the time travel perspective of New Voices on Food, Volume 2, I mean, I can imagine that the future is very hard for you to sort of hold and see before you. But what do you see? Where do you see yourself stepping to over the next little while?
The future has been an interesting one because when we left, all I could think about was returning back to Moscow. And now I'm thinking, well, we'll definitely stay in Australia for a few years. And who knows how long that will be, because in 4 or 5 years' time, my son will be 9 or 10 and he might not want to go back. He'll have a life here. And it's honestly, it's sort of a little bit anxiety inducing to think about the future. But I just hope that mainly that the war finishes and that Russia is able to get on some sort of a path of healing and admitting what it's done, which will take a long time. But I don't know. To be honest, I just currently, this year has been about one leg in front of the other. And, when I was in Moscow, it was literally taking it an hour at a time of trying to figure out what's happening next. And now I think I can see, I guess, a year ahead where we're here and I'm working and hopefully I'm writing more and my son's at school and, we're sort of getting more established in Sydney. And maybe a couple of years, but then it is hard to know what's ahead of us.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your perspective today and your contribution to New Voices on Food. Anna, thank you so much for having a chat with us today on Dirty Linen. It's just been wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Dani. Thanks so much for covering New Voices on Food and for having me.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinenat.deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This